He threw chairs. He grabbed players by the jersey. He built an empire on discipline so strict that his athletes were not even allowed to have their names stitched on the backs of their uniforms. And then, a kid from the west side of Chicago walked into his gym. A kid with a smile that could light up an arena and a crossover that made grown men fall down. Everything the coach stood against, wrapped in a 6'1" package. They should have destroyed each other. Instead, they built something neither of them ever managed to build with anyone else. This is the story of Bobby Knight and Isiah Thomas. To understand why this partnership should have been impossible, you first have to understand who Bob Knight was. Because Knight was not just a basketball coach, he was a philosophy. A walking, shouting, chair-throwing monument to the idea that basketball was not about individuals. It was about the collective, the system. Robert Montgomery Knight grew up in Orrville, Ohio, a small town where the values were simple and non-negotiable. Hard work, discipline, respect. He played college basketball at Ohio State, where he was a reserve on the 1960 national championship team alongside future legends Jerry Lucas and John Havlicek. And maybe that experience shaped him more than anything else. Because Knight was not the star. He was the guy on the bench, watching, studying, learning that talent alone was never enough. By the age of 24, he was the head coach at Army, coaching at West Point, immersed in a culture of discipline and hierarchy and absolute accountability. It was the perfect laboratory for the coach he would become. Army could not recruit the most talented players in the country, so Knight built his teams on defense, on execution, on squeezing every last drop out of limited rosters. And his teams overachieved year after year. In 1971, Indiana University came calling, and in Bloomington, Knight found his kingdom. The state of Indiana worships basketball the way other places worship religion, and Knight gave the state exactly what it wanted. Winning. Relentless, systematic, overwhelming winning. His motion offense became legendary. Constant movement, constant screening, constant reading of the defense. No set plays memorized like a script. Just principles, executed with total discipline by 5 players thinking as one. By 1976, Knight had built something that has never been seen since. His Hoosiers went 32 wins and 0 losses, capturing the national championship as the last undefeated team in the history of Division I men's college basketball. Half a century later, nobody has matched it. And here is the thing about how Knight won. His players wore plain uniforms. No names on the back, just the name on the front, Indiana. Because in Knight's world, no individual was ever bigger than the program. Flash was the enemy. Showmanship was a character flaw. A behind-the-back pass that could have been a chest pass was not creativity. It was selfishness. It was a player putting himself above the team. And in Bob Knight's gym, that was the deadliest sin of all. He was called the General. His practices were legendary for their intensity. Grown men, elite athletes, reduced to exhaustion and sometimes to tears. He screamed. He kicked players out of the gym. He demanded a level of mental toughness that broke some kids and forged others into something harder than they ever imagined they could become. And through it all, one belief sat at the center of everything. The system wins. Not the star, the system. Now hold that image in your mind, and let me take you 4 hours northwest to a very different world. The west side of Chicago in the 1960s and 1970s was one of the toughest places to grow up in America. Gangs controlled entire blocks. Violence was not an occasional tragedy. It was the background noise of daily life. Isiah Thomas III was born on April 30th, 1961, the youngest of 9 children. When he was 3 years old, his father left, and his mother, Mary Thomas, was left to raise 9 kids on her own in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the country. What Mary Thomas did over the next 15 years is one of the great untold stories in American sports. She worked. She fought. She stood on her porch and faced down gang leaders who came recruiting for her sons. She held that family together through poverty so severe that, as Isiah would later admit, the family sometimes could not keep the lights on. And in the middle of all of it, there was this little kid with a basketball. Several of his older brothers were phenomenal players in their own right. But one by one, the neighborhood swallowed them. The talent was there, but the escape route kept collapsing. So the family made a decision. Isiah was the one, the youngest, the most gifted, the last, best chance. Everything the Thomas family had left was invested in this one small, smiling boy. He enrolled at St. Joseph High School in Westchester, a suburban Catholic school miles away from home. To get there, Isiah woke up before dawn and made a commute that took hours. Crossing the city in the cold and the dark, sometimes hungry, always tired. He did it every single day. Because on the other side of that commute was a future. At St. Joseph, Isiah became the most electrifying young guard in America. By 1979, he was a McDonald's All-American, and every major program in the country wanted him. And this is where the story gets interesting, because the way those programs recruited Isiah Thomas tells you everything about college basketball in that era. Isiah has told these stories himself over the years, and they sound like scenes from a crime movie. Coaches showed up at the family home with promises of money, cars, and houses. One coach walked in with a briefcase, opened it up, and told the family it contained $50,000 in cash. $50,000 sitting on the table in a home where the electricity sometimes did not work. Isiah later joked that the family was so unfamiliar with money that there could have been $1,000 in that briefcase, and they would never have known the difference. And the plan, in Isiah's mind, was already made anyway. He was supposed to stay home and go to DePaul. His close friend Mark Aguirre, who grew up 2 blocks away, was already there. Terry Cummings was headed there too. A group of Chicago legends, all on one roster, all in their own city. Then Bob Knight walked through the door. No briefcase, no promises of cars or houses. Knight sat down in the Thomas living room, and according to Isiah, he barely even spoke to the recruit himself. Instead, he looked at Mary Thomas and told her he was going to offer her son exactly 3 things. First, he would get a good education. Second, Knight would teach him everything he knew about the game of basketball. And third, he would be a gentleman. That was it. That was the entire pitch. Isiah looked at his brothers. His brothers looked at him. And the message passing silently between them was crystal clear. There is no way we are going to Indiana. But then Isiah glanced over at his mother, and Mary Thomas was nodding. She was smiling, and Isiah felt his stomach drop because he knew that look. She liked this man. Before the night was over, though, the meeting nearly exploded into an actual fistfight. Mary Thomas was no fool. She knew exactly what Indiana was. Bloomington sat right next to Martinsville, a town with a long and ugly history of Ku Klux Klan activity, in a state where the Klan had once held enormous power. So she asked Knight the question directly. If my son comes to Indiana and runs into trouble with those people, who is going to protect him? Knight answered with a joke, and whatever the exact words were, the humor did not land. One of Isiah's older brothers took deep offense, and the temperature in the room went from tense to explosive in seconds. Words were exchanged, voices were raised, and then Bob Knight, in the middle of a recruiting visit, in another family's living room, stood up, took off his jacket, and started rolling up his sleeves. The head coach of Indiana University was ready to fight the recruit's family right there in the house. The room erupted. Family members jumped in between them, shouting that nobody was fighting anybody. According to the account in David Halberstam's famous book on basketball in that era, Knight tore into Isiah's brother with a furious rant, telling him he was a failure and that if Isiah stayed near him, he would be ruined too. Then Knight walked out, reportedly telling Isiah he was sorry to have lost him. Any normal recruitment would have died right there, but 2 things happened. First, Mary Thomas had seen something in Knight that the rest of the family missed. Here was a man who refused to lie to her, who refused to buy her son like a piece of property. Every other coach came in selling fantasies. Knight came in and told the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable, even when it nearly got him punched. To a mother who had spent her whole life fighting off smooth-talking predators, that honesty was worth more than any briefcase. And second, according to Halberstam's reporting, Isiah himself went to Knight the following day, in tears, and pleaded for the chance to play at Indiana. The flashiest guard in America, a kid who could have taken the money and stayed home to star at DePaul with his best friends, begged for the opportunity to play for the most demanding, most volatile, most anti-flash coach in the sport. When the decision was finally announced, it was not even Isiah who announced it. Ray Thomas called the press conference herself, sat down next to her son, and told the assembled reporters that Isiah had made his decision. He was going to Indiana University. Isiah has laughed about it since, because in truth, the decision was hers. Mom had chosen the man with the 3 promises. But before Isiah ever put on an Indiana uniform, he got a preview of exactly what he had signed up for. And it happened on an international stage, in an environment so intense that it ended with his future coach facing criminal charges in a foreign courtroom. In the summer of 1979, Bob Knight was named head coach of the United States national team for the Pan American Games in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And the roster he assembled included 2 high school phenoms who had never played a minute of college basketball: Ralph Sampson, the towering center from Virginia, and Isiah Thomas, the guard from Chicago who had just committed to play for Knight at Indiana. Isiah's roommate that summer was a lanky forward from Minnesota named Kevin McHale. Knight ran the team through brutal 2-a-day practices, sessions stretching past 2 hours each in the summer heat. And at night, McHale would be lying in bed, exhausted, when he would hear a voice from across the room. It was Isiah, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, saying he could not sleep. The kid was heading to Bloomington in a matter of weeks, and the reality of what 4 years under Bob Knight might feel like was keeping him up at night. McHale's response was less than sympathetic. He knew Isiah could not sleep because Isiah kept waking him up. The Americans were unstoppable on the court. They went 9-0 and won the gold medal, beating opponents by an average of more than 21 points per game. But the tournament became infamous for what happened off the court. Knight feuded with referees from the very first game, getting ejected while his team was up by 35 points. He made comments about the host country that caused genuine diplomatic offense. And then came the practice court incident that would follow him for the rest of his life. The American team arrived for a scheduled practice session and found the Brazilian women's team still on the floor, running roughly 10 minutes past their allotted time. For most coaches, that is a shrug and a 10-minute wait. For Bob Knight, it was an outrage. He confronted the police officer assigned to the gymnasium, a man named Jose Silva, demanding the court be cleared immediately. The argument escalated, and then, according to the charges that followed, Knight struck the officer. The head coach of the United States national team was arrested in the middle of an international competition for assaulting a policeman. Knight was charged and summoned to appear before a judge. Instead, when the games ended, he left the island and never came back. Puerto Rican authorities requested his extradition. Indiana officials refused, so Knight was tried in absentia, convicted, and sentenced to 6 months in prison, plus a $500 fine, a sentence he would never serve. The standoff dragged on for nearly a decade before Knight finally wrote a letter of apology to the president of the Puerto Rico Olympic Committee to close the chapter for good. And Isiah Thomas watched all of it happen. 18 years old, weeks away from enrolling at Indiana, watching his future coach get arrested, watching him rage at officials, watching the storm up close for the first time. If he wanted an exit, this was the moment. Plenty of people would have understood. Instead, he showed up in Bloomington that fall. And what happened next surprised everybody, including Isiah himself. Because here is the secret about Bob Knight's system that outsiders never understood. Everyone assumed the motion offense was a cage, a rigid, joyless machine that ground the individuality out of every player who entered it. Isiah assumed the same thing. He arrived in Bloomington bracing for a coach who would put handcuffs on his game. What he found was the opposite. Isiah has described it himself in interviews over the years. Within Knight's structure, there was enormous freedom. No memorized plays, just constant reading and reacting, making the right decision every single time based on what the defense gave you. The freedom was real, but it came with a price, and the price was responsibility. Every cut had to have a purpose. Every pass had to mean something. And for a player with Isiah's basketball intelligence, that bargain was not a cage at all. It was a playground. The kid was brilliant. Not just fast, not just skilled, but genuinely brilliant, with a processing speed that let him see plays developing before they happened. Knight, who had spent his career suspicious of flashy guards, found himself coaching a flashy guard whose flash was almost never wasted motion. The behind-the-back dribble came when the defender's angle demanded it. The no-look pass went to the open man because he actually was the open man. Isiah played spectacular basketball that was also, by Knight's ruthless standards, correct basketball. That did not mean the relationship was peaceful. It never was. Knight rode Isiah the way he rode everyone, and Isiah, raised by Ray Thomas and hardened by the West Side, was not a kid who folded. There were shouting matches. There were days when Isiah got thrown out of practice entirely. Knight gave him the nickname Pee-wee, and the affection in it coexisted with genuine, recurring conflict between two of the most competitive human beings the sport has ever produced. But in public, Knight defended him, consistently. The coach who tore into his players behind closed doors stood in front of the cameras and protected his point guard again and again. The Indiana fans, meanwhile, fell completely in love. They nicknamed him Mr. Wonderful. Students hung bedsheets in the stands, quoting the book of Isiah from the Old Testament, declaring that a little child shall lead them. As a freshman in the 1979 to 1980 season, Isiah teamed with senior Mike Woodson to lead the Hoosiers to the Big Ten championship and a run to the Sweet 16. The disciplinarian and the showman were not destroying each other. They were sharpening each other, which set the stage for the 1980 to 1981 season, the season that would define them both. Though for a long, miserable stretch of that winter, it looked like it would define them as failures. Indiana entered the year ranked in the top 5 in the country. Isiah was now a sophomore, the unquestioned leader, and expectations in Bloomington were at championship level. And then the season started, and the wheels came off. The Hoosiers stumbled through their non-conference schedule like a team that had forgotten how to play. They lost to Clemson, they traveled to Hawaii, and were beaten by a school called Pan American, a program so anonymous that Indiana's own players were reportedly asking each other who Pan American even was. That loss knocked the Hoosiers completely out of the national rankings. By the time conference play began, Indiana sat at 7 wins and 5 losses. Preseason top 5, now unranked and drifting. For most programs, that is a disappointing season taking shape. For Bob Knight's program, it was a 5-alarm crisis. The players called a meeting and aired out their frustrations. Knight kept grinding, kept teaching, kept demanding. And slowly, the season turned. Part of the turnaround was the emergence of Landon Turner, a 6'10" forward with immense physical gifts who had spent much of his career in and out of Knight's doghouse. When Turner finally put it together, Indiana suddenly had an interior force to pair with its brilliant backcourt. The Hoosiers started winning. Then they started winning big. But the defining moment of the regular season, the moment that revealed exactly how much Bob Knight had come to love his flashy point guard, happened on January the 31st, 1981, in a home game against Purdue. Indiana against Purdue is one of the nastiest rivalries in college basketball, and this edition boiled over. In the middle of the chaos, Isiah Thomas threw a punch at Purdue guard Roosevelt Barnes. Critics around the country piled on, describing it as a cheap shot, proof that the kid from the West Side did not belong in Knight's disciplined program. And what did the great disciplinarian do? He went to the tape, Knight reviewed the footage, and then he showed it publicly, demonstrating that Barnes had actually thrown the first punch and that Isiah was reacting to being hit. The coach, who had built his entire identity on accountability, stood in front of the world and fought for his players' reputation. Think back to that living room in Chicago. A mother asking a coach who would protect her son. 2.5 years later, she had her answer. Indiana closed the regular season on fire, winning their final games to capture the Big Ten title with a 14-4 conference record. The team that had been unranked and lost in December was suddenly one of the most dangerous teams in America in March. They entered the NCAA tournament as a 3 seed, which made them, on paper, an afterthought. They proceeded to deliver one of the most dominant tournament runs in the history of March Madness. First up was Maryland, a team loaded with future pros like Buck Williams and Albert King. Indiana annihilated them 99-64, with Isiah pouring in 25 points. Next came Alabama-Birmingham, dispatched by 15. Then St. Joseph's, the giant killer that had just upset number 1 seed DePaul, and Indiana beat them by 32 points. In the national semi-final at the Spectrum in Philadelphia, the Hoosiers met top-seeded LSU. And for a half, they were in genuine trouble, trailing 30-27 at the break with Isiah in foul trouble. In the locker room, Knight kept the message almost absurdly simple. He told his team to give him 20 minutes of basketball played their way. Indiana scored the first 11 points of the second half. Landon Turner, the Reclamation Project, scored 9 of them on his way to a game-high 20 points. The Hoosiers outscored LSU by 21 after halftime and won 67-49, holding the Tigers to their lowest point total in 17 years. 1 game left, Indiana against North Carolina, Bob Knight against Dean Smith, and a matchup between Isiah Thomas and a Tar Heels roster stacked with future NBA stars named James Worthy and Sam Perkins. But before we get to the game, you need to understand what happened that afternoon. Because March 30th, 1981 was one of the darkest days in modern American history. Hours before tip-off, in Washington, D.C., President Ronald Reagan was shot in an assassination attempt. The nation froze. The players heard the news in their hotel rooms in Philadelphia, watching the coverage like everyone else in America. For much of the afternoon, nobody knew whether the national championship game would even be played. Only after learning that the president was out of surgery and recovering did the tournament committee vote to go ahead. Tip-off was pushed back, and the 2 teams walked onto the court to decide a championship on a night when the whole country was holding its breath. And for one half, the biggest game of Isiah Thomas's life was a nightmare. He could not buy a basket. 1 for 7 from the field in the first half. Indiana shot under 38% as a team and trailed for most of the half. The season, the redemption story, the whole thing was slipping. Only a Randy Wittman jumper from the corner at the halftime buzzer gave Indiana a 1-point lead, 27-26, that felt far more fragile than it sounded. Whatever was said in that Indiana locker room at halftime, what came out of it was the best version of Isiah Thomas the college game ever saw. Early in the second half, he struck twice. 2 steals in quick succession, both converted into baskets, igniting a 12-4 run that flipped the entire game. North Carolina never recovered. Dean Smith, one of the greatest coaches in the history of the sport, said afterward that those steals were the turning point. Isiah caught fire from the outside, Wittman and Turner kept pouring it on, and the lead swelled to 14. When the final horn sounded, Indiana had won 63-50, and the Hoosiers were national champions. Isiah finished with a game-high 23 points and was named the most outstanding player of the Final Four. At the time, that Indiana squad went down as the team with the most losses ever to win a national championship, which tells you everything about the distance they traveled in 3 months. The flashy kid from the West Side and the coach who hated flash had climbed the mountain together. and they had done it precisely because of the collision between them, not in spite of it. Knight gave Isiah the structure, the defensive discipline, the decision-making framework that turned a spectacular talent into a complete player. Isiah gave Knight something the coach could never manufacture in a gym: improvisational genius, the ability to break a game open in 90 seconds with a heartbeat of brilliance that no motion offense could ever diagram. Here is a statistic that should stop you cold. Across 29 years at Indiana, across all the wins and all the banners, Bob Knight coached exactly one player who would go on to become an NBA All-Star. One. And it was Isiah Thomas, the coach whose entire philosophy was built on the idea that stars did not matter. Reached his greatest heights the moment he made peace with the greatest star he ever had. And then, almost immediately, it ended. Weeks after the championship, in April of 1981, Isiah announced that he was leaving Indiana. He was passing up his final 2 years of eligibility and entering the NBA draft. He was 19 years old, he had a national title, and he had a family back in Chicago that had sacrificed everything for him. The Detroit Pistons selected him with the 2nd overall pick, right behind his childhood friend Mark Aguirre, who went first to Dallas. It was, by any rational measure, the correct decision. But Bob Knight was not always a rational man, and departures were never simple with him. He was a coach who took almost everything personally, who could treat a departure like a betrayal and hold a grudge for decades. And over the years, plenty of reporting has described a long period of coolness and distance between Knight and his greatest player after Isiah left early. Two proud, stubborn, ferociously competitive men, connected forever by a championship, and never quite sure how to talk to each other once the season ended. But here is a detail that tells you the relationship never truly broke. When Isiah left for the NBA, he made a promise to Ray Thomas that he would finish his degree. And he kept it. 6 years later, while starring for the Pistons, Isiah earned his degree in criminal justice from Indiana University. He received it on Mother's Day, the first of Knight's 3 promises in that Chicago living room. The education was fulfilled after all, not because the coach demanded it, because the mother did. In the NBA, Isiah became a 12-time All-Star. He led the Detroit Pistons, the infamous Bad Boys, to back-to-back championships in 1989 and 1990, winning Finals MVP honors along the way. And the funny thing is, the Bad Boys were, in their own bruising way, a Bob Knight team. Defense first, toughness as identity, the collective over the individual. Isiah, the flashiest guard of his generation, captained a dynasty built on grit, and you can draw a straight line from those Detroit teams back to a practice gym in Bloomington. Knight's story after Isiah is more complicated and more painful. He won a 3rd national title in 1987 with Steve Alford. He coached the United States to Olympic gold in 1984 with a young Michael Jordan. He finished his career with 902 wins, for a time the most in the history of the college game. His players graduated at rates that embarrassed the rest of the sport, and he was never once accused of cheating in an era drowning in scandal. But the temper never softened. The chair he hurled across the court against Purdue in 1985 became the defining image of his rage. The incidents piled up, year after year, until Indiana University instituted a zero-tolerance policy on his behavior. And in September of 2000, after one final incident, the school fired him. The general was relieved of his command. What followed was one of the saddest standoffs in the history of college sports. Knight, wounded and furious, refused to set foot in Assembly Hall, the building he filled with banners, the program he made into a religion. For 20 years, he stayed away, rejecting invitation after invitation, while an entire generation of Indiana fans grew up never having seen him on that floor. Then, on February 8, 2020, it finally happened. Knight was 79 years old by then, and his health was visibly failing. But at halftime of a game against Purdue, of all opponents, he walked out of the tunnel and onto the court at Assembly Hall for the first time in 2 decades. The crowd did not cheer. It detonated. Grown adults wept in the stands. Dozens of his former players surrounded him at center court. And in the middle of that scene, Bob Knight found Isiah Thomas, and he hugged him. The old coach wrapped his arm around the flashy kid he never should have wanted, the star he never should have tolerated, the player who gave him his second championship and then left him 2 years too soon. Whatever distance had existed between them, whatever years had gone unspoken, it all collapsed in that moment on the floor where they had once been perfect together. Knight led the crowd in a chant of defense, because of course he did. Even at the end, even overwhelmed with emotion, the message was the same one he had been delivering since West Point. And Isiah stood beside him through all of it. Bob Knight passed away on November 1st, 2023, at the age of 83. And that night, as tributes poured in from across the basketball world, Isiah Thomas shared a video montage of his playing days at Indiana, writing that lots of teammate tears were flowing that night for their coach. Not for the chair thrower, not for the general, for their coach. So what do we actually make of these two men and what they built together? It would be easy to tell this story as a simple redemption arc. The tyrant who learned to bend, the showman who learned to submit. But that is not really what happened. Bob Knight did not stop hating Flash, and Isiah Thomas did not stop being flashy. What actually happened is rarer and more interesting. Two people who should have been incompatible looked past the surface and recognized something in each other. Knight looked at Isiah and saw past the smile and the crossover to a kid raised by a mother of iron, forged by a brutal commute and a brutal neighborhood, who craved structure, whose spectacular game was built on fundamentally correct decisions. And Isiah looked at Knight and saw past the screaming and the fury to a man who told his mother the truth when a lie would have been easier. A man whose 3 unglamorous promises turned out to be worth more than every briefcase full of cash that ever crossed the Thomas family's doorstep. Mary Thomas saw it first, before her son did, before the fans did, before Knight himself fully understood what he was getting. A mother from the west side of Chicago looked at the most feared coach in America, a man who had nearly come to blows with her own family minutes earlier, and decided that this was the man she trusted with her last best hope. She was right. About all of it. The education happened, the basketball mastery happened, all the way to a national championship, 2 NBA titles, and the Hall of Fame. And the gentleman part, the part that seemed like a throwaway line in a recruiting pitch, revealed itself decades later in a degree earned on Mother's Day, in a hug at center court, in teammate tears for a coach the whole world had been told was impossible to love. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting basketball documentaries. Until next time.